Hello, everyone. This is Christian Massar with another episode of the Historical Thoughts podcast. I hope you're all doing well. And today, what I want to be talking about is I'm going into a little bit of historiography. So I'm going to be looking into reviewing actually an old Russian history textbook, the first Russian history textbook that I used actually in university. So I'd like to review that, and I'll be using an historical framework for that. And I have to admit, historiography is not really my forte. When people use certain models to analyze something and whatever, I don't know. I didn't really get those kinds of classes and stuff like that, so I have to admit it took a while to get used to them. But I'm going to take a stab at it here, and we'll talk about that textbook, and we'll talk about the framework specifically. I think mostly I'll be talking about the framework itself. But let's get right into it after this little message.
Hello, listeners. Thank you so much for listening to this podcast, and I sure hope that you've been enjoying the thoughts given in the Historical Thoughts and Interpretations episodes. But I would like to ask if you would consider making a pledge to the podcast via Patreon. I have many projects in mind for this podcast, and the books, paper, and so on needed to produce the episodes will not be free. Help keep Historical Thoughts flowing so that we can interpret the past and learn from it. You may pledge any amount that you like, and whatever you choose to give will be appreciated. If you would like to donate, go to my Patreon link at patron.podbean.com/historicalthoughts. And again, that's patron.podbean/historicalthoughts. Now, let's get back to the episode.
The textbook can be a convenient medium through which to communicate a nation's history. In this review, I will attempt to judge a rather thorough account of Russia's historical narrative. A History of Russia, the Soviet Union, and Beyond is the textbook I will analyze, specifically the 6th edition published in 2002. This is the one I got when I did the course about 10 years ago. It was written by David MacKenzie of the University of North Carolina and Michael W. Curran of Ohio State University. And this textbook, A History of Russia, attempts to introduce readers to that country's vast and rich story. In its 738 pages, the text begins with Russia's ancient origins and ends with an assessment of President Vladimir Putin, as of 2002, when he had only been president for about 2 years. I personally used this textbook in a course about Imperial Russia. In spring 2013, when I was doing this course, in fact, a professor at Kansas State University, David Stone, also recommended this book as a preparation resource for a graduate level course about the history of Russian security. A previous edition of the book was also given positive feedback, which I will discuss at the end. How will I analyze A History of Russia? I could utilize a myriad of theoretical historical frameworks, and for this particular book, I've chosen to use 2 frameworks, that of Hayden White and James Loewen. First, I shall summarize White and Loewen's methodologies. Then I will apply these frameworks to the textbook. And finally, I will give some of my own impressions of the textbook itself. So, the narrative framework of Hayden White. Who was this guy? Who was Hayden White? He was, in fact, not an historian, as he focused instead on literary studies. But he saw historical works as narratives or stories that historians told. He wanted to create a framework through which historical narratives could be analyzed according to their structures rather than necessarily their historical content. This framework could do 2 things. First, it could reveal historians' styles, and secondly, stories could be gleaned from chronicles, answering questions such as, what happened then, and how did this event happen? White defines a chronicle as an open-ended historical story that abruptly starts at a chosen point and does not end with a final resolution. National histories are good examples of chronicles, as they can start from prehistoric times, as some Canadian history textbooks do, for example, or any other arbitrary important date in that country's timeline. For example, when you look at books about Viking history, a lot of Viking historical narratives seem to start at the raid at Lindisfarne in the 8th century. I'm not exactly of the year, but I believe that's usually the point where a lot of Viking history start. And a particular country's history is constantly changing, so it's unlikely that a text about that history will end with sufficient closure. Soon enough, new editions or sequels are bound to be written. And of course, textbooks are tricky. You're trying to summarize things for students of various levels, right? Whether it's a high school level textbook or maybe even a social studies course for grade 8 students. You're not going to, and maybe even in high school, I don't think you would have a textbook for a specific country unless it's maybe, unless you're in America and you have a textbook, you have a history course specifically about American history. Or you're in Canada and you have a course specifically about Canadian history. But, I guess it would depend. But in university, you'd be more likely to have specialized courses specializing on British history or Russian history, for example. But even then, when you're doing, like the course that I took the Imperial Russia, it started with all the way back from Kievan Rus, and I think a little bit even earlier, all the way up, like I said, to Vladimir Putin. But I was taking an Imperial Russia course, so it basically ended with the Communist Revolution. But the textbook carried on. So that's the thing. Even though this textbook was huge, 700 pages, it still had to summarize a lot of things, right? This wasn't a deep dive, and it gave a lot of deep dives into various things like Peter the Great's reforms and so on, but it didn't really go in depth into anything, really. While if you have something that's in depth about the Smuta or the Raskol, for example, you're going to have 700-page books on that one topic. So so textbooks, they're like what we like to say, 30,000 feet views. You get a good view of everything, but you don't get a detailed view of each specific thing. Now, that's almost impossible to do in a textbook. You'll be carrying a book in your bag, and you have no room for anything else. Hayden White conceived numerous methods of explanation for chronicle analysis. They could be combined to fit narratives into specific categories. The following explanation methods are used in White's model: implotment, formal argument, ideological implication, and tropes. And we'll go into these one by one. Explanations by implotment. Explanation by implotment helps analysts figure out the genre of an historical narrative. White describes 4 historical implotments, or the archetypical story modes that help historians tell, quote-unquote, what really happened. These four story modes are comedy, tragedy, romance, and satire. So again, comedy, tragedy, romance, and satire. In a comedic narrative, reconciliations are achieved between conflicting parties. Temporary, hopeful triumphs are celebrated. But the situation is left half resolved. The story is open-ended, if you will. Tragic narratives are, of course, the opposite. The history's protagonist ultimately falls, and if there are celebrations, they are illusory and produce false hope. In the third story mode, romantic, the hero meets a challenge and finally overcomes it. Military, nationalist, and even economic histories are likely to be romantic in order to place the narrator's soldiers, country, and way of life in a positive light. And finally, there is the satirical implotment. Satires offer mythical representations of events. They are used when the previous implotments are considered inadequate to depict events. Simon Schama's book, Dead Certainties, Unwarranted Speculations, could be considered an historical satire, as it uses mythologized historical narratives to demonstrate that we have, quote, broken lines of communication to the past. Explanations by formal argument. Explanations by formal argument, as opposed to implotment, deal with the idea of common sense ideas or universal historical laws, so to speak, that could explain, for instance, why or how the Crusades occurred, for example. Such ideas are used to turn history into a sort of science which universal laws govern, just like physics. But White suggests that history is a proto-science, because there is no unanimous agreement between historians like there is between scientists. History is less of an experiment-driven, observable field than science. Thus, according to White's framework, there is no possibility for binding historical laws. Even if historians want to create laws to explain historical phenomena, there will be no universal agreement, so there will still be arguments. This thing about historical laws, yeah, I agree that you can't really bind historical laws to events, but there are fields of study like this, and of course, like, what do you call Marxism? Marxism is a framework or a philosophy that tries to explain the world through the class struggle. So that's a law, and then other more capitalist friendly systems or philosophies will say that philosophy or capitalism is what makes the world run, and markets, and things like the invisible hand, and all of this stuff too. So there are the ideas of historical laws, but whether they can be applied in all cases, that's the thing, right? And there will be arguments. A Marxist will say that struggle is about class struggle and everything like that, but a capitalist will say that markets are going to solve problems, and therefore markets create democracy, and so on. So there's going to be that argument. So I can agree more or less with what White has said, but the fact is that there are historical laws, and you also have to take into account human nature. One of the big critiques of communism and Marxism is that human nature is, humans are naturally greedy and naturally violent and so on. So that's why a lot of people are very skeptical of a perfectly run communist system, especially when it's done from top to bottom, especially when it's dictated from those at the top. And that's why somebody looking at a possible future world like Star Trek, a lot of people are very skeptical of that, where there's no money, yet there's harmony, there's no violence on Earth, there's no crime on Earth. Yeah, right. Tell me another one. Although Star Trek is mighty cool. So, about formal argument, there are 4 ways to make explanations by formal argument: formist, organicist, mechanistic, and contextualist. Formist arguments uniquely identify certain objects in history. While generalizations may be made about historical processes, agents, events, and so on are completely unique. A particular historical event will happen once, and although similar events may happen later, that event will never happen again. So people that might agree with a formist argument or formist mode of argument might say that history doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes. An organicist argument will see agents as part of processes, which are constantly developing and changing. But the final process is always greater than the sum of its parts. The organicist argument seeks to answer the question, how do all of these elements fit together? Instead of historical laws, as described earlier, it's interested in ideas or general principles, as well as the final result of the agents and events. The mechanistic view also sees every historical agent as part of a whole. But unlike the organicist argument, this mode reduces agency and personal choice or influence by searching for deterministic laws of history. So actors are made part of the great machine of history, and events keep the machine running. In the organicist argument, historical figures are free to operate within the paradigm of ideas and principles, but in the mechanistic view, they are bound in a system of inescapable, inevitable laws that determine their interactions. And these laws are considered far more important than the actual events and actors which they govern. So that's the subtle difference. Think of the mechanistic view as seeing history as part of as a big machine, the great machine of history. Again, but it's just like any machine, it's just like any real machine, like a car or an airplane, they're subject to the laws of physics and science. Finally, the 4th mode of argument, in contextualism, quote, events can be explained by being set within the context of their occurrence, according to White. Each event has its own context, and each actor involved has his or her own relationships, motivations, backgrounds, and so on. Events happen because of the relationships between actors. Actors and events influence each other. This leads to narrative of, quote, manifestly significant occurrences. Contextualist arguments give actors agency within the context of their particular situation. Thus, these arguments reject the mechanistic laws that dictate cause and effect. But they also reject the formalist idea that every single event is completely different. Just like anything else, historical events should be looked at in their individual context and environments. Similar events can happen in 2 totally different regions or environments, and thus completely different contexts. Right, so contextualism, I think contextualism makes a lot of sense, right? There are not necessarily any laws, right? Because if you try to apply a certain law to situation 1, and then that same law to situation 2, it might not work out the same way. The American Revolution had its own context, and the Russian Revolution and the French Revolutions had their own context as well. And then there were other revolutions that failed and brought about completely different results and everything like that. So that's kind of a situation, and that's, I think that's a very interesting point about actors and events influencing each other. That's the whole thing about agency, where the mechanistic view, saying that actors and events are just part of a whole machine and they have no agency, they have no choice. No, people have choices. No matter what situation they are in. If there's a revolution, if they take part of in the revolution, or if they're against the revolution, or whatever, no matter what side they're on, or if they're neutral, they have choices. And one person can influence another. They can persuade each other. They can fight each other. They can attack each other. They can kill each other. They can do all kinds of things. So I think for me, the contextualist argument makes the most sense. The idea that, yeah, there are no laws dictating things, but there are similar events. There are certain things. You can compare events. I've done that before, like comparing certain philosophies or comparing certain events. I've done a little bit of that before. And they're not all the same. So it's not like the law of gravity, which affects everything exactly the same way. But there are different contexts, right? Yeah, I did one podcast a long time ago. I did a little bit of a comparison between the October Revolution, when Lenin's communists finally took power from the Russian Provisional Government in 1917. But then, November in the Western calendar, but October Revolution at the time of the revolution, when they were using the Julian calendar in Russia, and I compared that to the failed coup attempt in Turkey in 2016, right? So, you can compare things. You can compare, this revolution succeeded, this coup attempt did not succeed because of these reasons. So, you can use those contexts. You can look at different contexts and compare them, but there's not necessarily a universal law. And also, everyone in this situation had their own individual choices. Now, what about explanation by ideological implication? White is not concerned with political parties in his concept of ideological implication. This concept, rather, represents ideas of where society should go. These ideals are reflected in historical narratives. And White, puts out 4 possible explanations by ideological implication: conservative, liberal, radical, and anarchic. If a narrative has a conservative ideological implication, it means that social changes are ideally gradual and very slow, if there's any change at all. For instance, a conservative history might show how some agency, institution, or practice remained unchanged, even during times of great turmoil, such as the French or communist revolutions. Parts of the great social machine are changed, but there's no immediate wholesale paradigm shift. In liberalism, the remote past is idealized, so it is fairly romantic ideological implication. Like the conservative one, liberalism aims to change just parts of the machine. However, liberalism seeks to deliberately tweak these parts in order to better society, instead of waiting for things to change like conservatism. Or, in conservatism, if it changes at all, again. Radical and anarchic implications are completely different. They are both interested in cataclysmic transformations. Yet radicals believe that a better society is just around the corner and a revolution must happen to make it reality. Think of Marxists. Anarchists, in contrast, are nostalgic, looking back to a pure, uncorrupted society. No government, no banks, no this. This can happen at any time, as long as people can reject the current corrupt and, quote, illegitimate society. Thus, revolution is not as crucial. Now, I don't want to go too much into that ideological implication, but let's go into tropes. And finally, we arrive at White's idea of tropes. I hope you've been with me so far. We've talked about ideological implication. We've talked about formal argument. We've talked about implantment. Right, implantment being whether something is comedic, tragic, romantic, or satirical. Formal argument, whether it is formist, organicist, mechanistic, or contextualist, how history works. And then ideological implication, depending on what's the ideal. And then now we have tropes, the 4th thing. This is the final building block of White's analytical framework. A trope is an archetype or structure that is used to explain something. Again, White uses 4 tropes in his framework: metaphor, metonymy, synecdoche, and irony. A metaphor is used to describe something by giving it the attributes of something else. For example, A graduate student may be described as an earthen vessel that is filled up by learning new knowledge. A metonymy calls one thing by using the name of one of its attributes. White uses an example in which a fleet of 50 ships may be called 50 sail, right? A synecdoche describes an object by using a part of it. In essence, an attribute or part of something is used to define it. And finally, when using irony, somebody says one thing to mean another. Depending on its context and tone, the sentence, quote, Bob was very interested in meeting his lawyer, could mean that he was not interested in meeting his lawyer. You know, a bit of sarcasm. So these four things, implotment, formal argument, ideological implication, and tropes. These are the things that are part of Hayden White's narrative analytical paradigm. As I mentioned at the beginning of this description, we can use it to analyze an historical work and place it in a certain category. For example, a narrative may be a liberal, contextualist, and comedic narrative that uses a lot of irony. So kind of like categorizing one of Shakespeare's plays, for example. Is it a tragedy? Is it kind of satirical? Is it this, So we can use that for historical works. What is the purpose of such an analysis? White said that his framework could help us understand an historian's historical graphical style. Also, if we look at historical works as narratives or stories, we open new modes of inquiry and new questions may be asked. For example, why did this historian describe this event in that way? What does his ideal society look like? How does he feel about this event? Is it a good or a bad thing in his eyes? What are the moral and ethical implications of this historical narrative? Kind of a simpler way of looking at this is kind of like when you see a news report, for example, a news report may claim to be neutral and just looking at the facts, but maybe by the wording, it might not appear so neutral, right? It might not even be intentional. But a certain word may be in there, or a certain tone of voice, or certain something may be in there that causes things to maybe not look so neutral, right? So what is the message of this? And so this analytical paradigm of Hayden White is kind of a way of analyzing something in a more complicated way than just, what words did the person use? What tone was there? Soon, I shall attempt to place a history of Russia, the Soviet Union, and beyond within Hayden White's framework. Again, the 2002 edition. But first, I shall look at another theorist, James Loewen, who clearly despises how most textbooks are written. So, James W. Loewen is a social scientist who wrote the book Lies My Teachers Told Me, a scathing review of feel-good history and the textbooks that promote such narratives. In this book, Loewen is bothered about how textbook writers do such things as manipulating facts and cherry-picking them to make history teachable. He dislikes how many textbooks are filled cover to cover with nationalism and how they heroize or idolize or lionize, perhaps, historical characters. Textbooks are often huge, overly full of information, Loewen says. They're crammed with details which the authors or publishers are afraid will destroy the narrative if left out. This leads to books that quote, average 4.5 pounds in weight and 888 pages in length. They also, quote, encourage students to believe that history is facts to be learned, end quote, blinding students to the fact that history is in fact a field of, quote, again, furious debate informed by evidence and reason. Textbooks, argues Loewen, cheapen the historical profession. Worse, they do a great disservice to history students and historians by teaching whitewashed, simplistic, and, quote, friendly narratives, even of history's darlings, that were real-life monsters. To illustrate some of Loewen's concerns, I will briefly look at his interpretations of traditional American heroes and how they are portrayed in American textbooks. The first example he uses is that of Helen Keller. In many history textbooks, Keller is shown as a great American humanitarian, yet much of her life is ignored. Loewen believes this is to be lying, quote, by omission. Textbooks leave out the fact that Keller, in fact, became a radical socialist who left for joy at the news of the Russian Communist Revolution. Many American historical textbooks might not be interested in showing that fact. As a socialist, she was an object of derision in the media at the time, and she harshly criticized the American social system. Helen Keller was clearly a radical figure, and Loewen says that American media has omitted this fact, just as the media of Keller's day poured contempt upon her for her ideas. Loewen then analyzes the track record of President Woodrow Wilson. Wilson is often depicted as a great leader who, quote, reluctantly brought America into World War I and worked valiantly to create the League of Nations after that conflict. I remember doing a high school history course, history grade 12, in British Columbia, and it was like that too. And this was a Canadian class. I'm not sure if the textbook was Canadian, but I don't think it was. But I don't remember who published the book, and I don't even remember the book's name. But it was kind of like that. It showed Woodrow Wilson as this great American visionary, and I'm gonna create a system that's gonna be like a precursor to the United Nations. We're gonna prevent war from ever happening again, and so on. Yeah, very much so. And divide. Have self-determination for all these different groups, and yeah, he was seen as this great visionary guy. It's like let the different ethnic groups of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the former Austro-Hungarian Empire, break up the Austro-Hungarian Empire and let all the different ethnic groups inside, the Austrians, Hungarians, Croats, everybody, let's let them have their own thing. Let's create the state of Yugoslavia. And but though Yugoslavia included a bunch of ethnic groups in one country, not their own countries, but so that I remember that actually from many years ago. And Woodrow Wilson is described as a man of progress, an ideal man for the job. Yet Lowen notes that President Wilson sent American troops to intervene in Mexico, Haiti, the Dominican Republic, Cuba, Panama, and what later became the Soviet Union. After the Communist Revolution, the American troops were sent to stop the communists. Right? So, and textbooks justify Wilson by saying, quote, he had no choice but to carry out these interventions. And Lowen says that no American textbook he investigated anyway even mentioned the president's Soviet mission, though Russian books talking about it a lot. And it gets even worse. Lowen says that Wilson was a white supremacist. In 1916, Wilson pushed African Americans out of the federal government. I know that, I'm certainly no expert on President Woodrow Wilson myself, so I can't really comment a whole lot, but I do know that one cynical historian on YouTube really hates Woodrow Wilson. So it would be interesting to investigate that further. But I am very familiar with the fact that Woodrow Wilson was he's always idolized in textbooks, but he's always again this man of progress, but these other things are like casting doubt on those things. And finally, Lowen dedicates an entire chapter to the American narrative of Christopher Columbus. Lowen spends considerable time to note how textbook authors like to start their American chronicles at Columbus's landfall in 1492. This makes textbooks ignore, or at least give passing nods to earlier possible American quote-unquote discoverers. Forget Native Americans and First Nations, which obviously arrived there first. But Lowen continues noting how Columbus is depicted as a courageous, undaunted hero of discovery. The voyage across the Atlantic is sometimes depicted as long, arduous, and dangerous. And just as with Woodrow Wilson, Columbus's story gets worse. American textbooks ignore Columbus's reign of terror in the New World, under which Native people were mutilated, raped, and enslaved. Lowen says that when these atrocities are ignored and when Columbus is heroized as the quote-unquote discoverer of America, we risk, quote, identifying with the oppressor. He also says that feel-good histories, such as American stories about Columbus, are boring. No wonder, he says, students lose interests. So now, finally, let's go to this A History of Russia textbook in the framework of Hayden White, and I'll try to put it in Hayden White's framework. According to White's analytical model, A History of Russia is clearly a chronicle. Its narrative starts in the Eurasian plain, quote, north of the Black Sea. It begins in a very distant past that is mysterious due to, quote, an almost total lack of historical sources. Definitely true. When you're looking at Russian history, when you go into ancient Russian history, like in the, one of my professors always said it was a very precious thing. Like when you found a primary source, it was so precious. The book then continues throughout the millennia, ending with a detailed analysis of Vladimir Putin's presidency, which had only started 2 years prior to the publication of the 6th edition, remember, in 2002. At the end of the book, there's no grand comment of Russia's role in world history or some other neat concluding remark. Russia's story was not completely told in 2002. Well, of course, no country's history was at that time. And it's still being written as history progresses. A history of Russia is thus an open-ended narrative, as many other national histories would be, for it simply says that, quote, much remains to be done in Russia. I will analyze this somewhat somber comment in more detail very soon. Analyzing this textbook through White's framework might be a bit hard because it looks at problems from completely different perspectives. While the textbook does assert facts, it is also a guide to the myriad theories that exist in Russian historiography. Thus, it took a fair amount of thought for me to give a history of Russia its own space in White's system. So what mode of emplotment does this textbook use? Is it a romantic history? No. A history of Russia does not end on a happy note. It lists Russia's numerous problems in the early 2000s, which included a low birth rate, bad infrastructure, poor health, crime, and more. As I just noted a little while ago, the textbook ends with the sobering words, much remains to be done. At the end of this textbook story, Mother Russia does not enjoy an ending in which everything is happily resolved. So, does it have a tragic emplotment then? I will answer no to this question too. Many tragic moments are described in this book, as any Russian history book should. For instance, Ivan the Terrible's oppressive Oprichnina system is blamed for a disastrous loss of life, a demoralized army, and other ills. The time of troubles of the Smuta is described as a hellish time of multiple foreign invasions, succession disputes, and false tsars. But as we've just seen, a history of Russia's narrative doesn't leave us with a real conclusion, either good or bad. It's not saying that Russia's history has always been dark and it will always be this way. It doesn't say that. So, is this book a satire then? No. This textbook makes an attempt to be a serious historical work. Of course, why would a textbook be a satire? And it even cautions readers about blindly accepting the primary Russian chronicle, which is an early source of Russian history, one of the earliest, as it's considered fairly mythical, right? So this book is not trying to, I can't think of an example, but you can imagine that some books will look at something and they'll kind of go into, and this is these maybe some older textbooks. These are the origins of these people. This is the origins of this people right here. This people's ethnic background is Slavic. The people's ethnic background is actually Finnic, Finno-Ugric, and so on. But that textbook, from what I remember, it was a very long time ago since I read it. But from what I remember, it went into some of the theories of ancient Russia and kind of the origins of what is now Russia and so on. But again, it's still kind of cautioned. Yeah, this is fairly mythical. This is fairly, we don't, it was kind of like these are some of the ideas and these are some of the arguments for it. If it's not tragic, if it's not romantic, if it's not satirical, a history of Russia must use comedic emplotment then, right? Yes, much remains to be done in Russia, as the book says. But the Russians have also made progress in overcoming some of their troubles. Vladimir Putin in that book was said to have been a counter to the old corrupt Soviet regime. After all, MacKenzie and Curran, the writers of the textbook, note that Russia had an impressive economic recovery in the Putin era, especially, partially due to high oil prices. And, Russia of the 2000s, when this book was being written, and, later on, especially perhaps, was a lot better than Russia immediately after the Soviet collapse, right? And, of course, the book also mentions the efforts to make its military more efficient. Well, now we're in October 2022, and, seeing the efforts of the war in Ukraine, how effective those reforms have been. Anyway, so this textbook leaves us with a sense that some of Russia's issues are at least temporarily and partially resolved as of 2002. With this in mind, the comedic emplotment makes the most sense. I think if we're gonna, if we have to force it into a framework, I think that would make the most sense, right? Because it's saying, yeah, there is some hope. There's a lot to be done. It's not saying that Russia's history is all great and its future is completely bright or anything like that, but it's just saying, it's saying that there's a lot of progress, there's still a lot of progress to be done, but a lot of progress has been made, right? So, I would say the comedic emplotment makes the most sense. What about White's model of ideological implication in this book? The radical and anarchist implications do not fit this textbook very well. Because this book analyzes such a large timeline, about the 10th century to the early 21st, catastrophic events such as the Smuta and the Communist Revolution are somewhat far apart from each other. The textbook does not jump immediately between these cataclysmic climaxes, but it rather gives a lot of information and explanations in between them, and also talks about a lot of events in between these cataclysmic events. More importantly, it also does not romanticize the Communist Revolution and the subsequent Soviet policies. So it's not really advocating for great social change like a radicalist implication of like, oh, we just need another revolution and we're just going to fix it. And it's not anarchist in the way of saying like, oh, let's go back to the period of Peter the Great when everything was good and Russia was a great empire. It doesn't do that. It's just presenting the history. Overall, a history of Russia shows change as happening slowly in the country. The rise of Moscow is shown as a somewhat long and certainly a hard process. Cultural conservatism is certainly shown as a force in Russian history. The authors actually considered Kievan Rus's adoption of Byzantine Christianity in 988 as a stifling force that would, quote, inhibit future Russian cultural development. The authors would argue that the religious turmoil surrounding the old believers in the 17th century would be due to Russian conservatism. So I can't say this book should be pegged as having a conservative ideological implication either. Again, like I just said, it's not anarchist in looking back to an ideal society such as Peter the Great, but it's also not saying that slow change is a good thing, right? It's not saying that like the conservative ideological implication might. The book's depiction of Peter the Great's reforms could be interpreted as giving it a slightly liberal implication. These reforms were meant to transform Imperial Russia's ineffective and corrupt bureaucracy and political system. Though these reforms were not completely effective, you know what reform is, the book shows Peter tweaking the system to better his society. And they certainly were not cataclysmic. However, these reforms are not looked upon with a nostalgic eye to the past, but rather with an optimistic eye to the future. So, again, putting something into a framework like this is kind of a little difficult, right? So, but I think the liberal implication makes the most sense, at least when it comes to talking about Peter the Great's reforms. You know, talking about, the Russian history is changing. It is always changing. It is always changing slowly. The textbook is showing that. It always changes slowly, and Peter the Great's reforms are there. But it didn't destroy Russia to rebuild it. It just changed a lot of the historical machine of Russia, right? So that's more of a liberal implication. We are tweaking things, we're making things run a little bit better, but we're not destroying the system like an anarchist or a radical system or implication might say. So far, I would say the book has a comedic implantment and a liberal ideological implication, right? What about the mode of argument? A history of Russia has three main ideas that define Russia: autocracy, collectivism, and mysticism. According to the book, autocracy, or statism, emerged during the unification of Great Russia after 1450. This central power base, this authors argue, lasted until Russia's very recent democratic governments. Until that time, Russia was under autocratic czars and powerful Soviet governments. I mean, of course, there are certain things like the Novgorodian Republic, the Veche, and all these other experiments with democracy over the period of reform. But overall, Russia did have a very autocratic system. And, I would say it does now too. MacKenzie and Curran say that under autocracy, individualism was discouraged and serfdom lasted from around 1550 until the 1860s. The resulting paradigm of collectivism, then, helped Russia survive multiple crises, including the Second World War. And finally, mysticism and the subsequent cultural conservatism separated Russia from the intellectual West. Mysticism is said to have led to Russian mistrust of foreigners, even in the atheist Soviet age. I don't want to unpack that too much, but this is what they're saying, right? So the main ideas that define Russia are autocracy, collectivism, and mysticism, according to this textbook. However, these three ideas did not always define Russian events. For example, mysticism did not prevent the atheistic communist revolution, even if it did encourage Soviet xenophobia, according to the textbook. Tsarist and Soviet autocracy also did not last forever. And also I mentioned other things too. Russian history is full of experiments with sort of, semi-democratic things. So these, and of course look at 1905 where there was the Duma, right? So there were attempts at this. So these ideas certainly helped define Russian history, and they explain why some trends tend to repeat. But they are not necessarily immutable laws again, as a mechanist mode of argument would suggest. And similar events, such as the Communist Revolution and peasant rebellions against serfdom, appear in completely different contexts and times. Because of these factors, a history of Russia has more of a contextualist mode of argument. So, comedic, liberal, contextualist. Okay, I think that's so far. And finally, what about tropes? I'll talk about this very briefly. This is a serious historical work, and it tries to portray Russian history accurately. So, irony is not a valid trope to describe it. But I do argue that this book uses synecdoche. I point again to the just mentioned three main ideas: autocracy, collectivism, and mysticism. These ideas are shown to be attributes of Russia's very character, and they are used to define and guide Russia's whole history, according to the textbook. So, finally, I would say A History of Russia, that the edition from 2002, has a comedic emplotment, liberal ideological implication, and a contextualist mode of argument, and it uses a synecdoche trope. There we go. So, according to Hayden White's model. Now, what about Lowen? Would James Lowen despise A History of Russia like he does many American textbooks? To answer this question, I'll first look at how MacKenzie and Curran depict some of Russia's great people. From chapters 2 to 8, MacKenzie and Curran discuss the Kievan Rus and Mongol yoke periods. A few Russian heroes appear in these chapters, such as Vladimir the Great and Alexander Nevsky. Yet the authors do not explicitly heroize these characters. For example, there's Alexander Nevsky, the leader of the Novgorod Republic. He is one of the greatest men in Russian history, and he also became an important character in epic Soviet cinema. In A History of Russia, the textbook, his victory against the invading Teutonic Knights is indeed shown as significant, the Battle of Lake Peipus. Despite this, there would come the Tatar yoke, a 2 centuries period during which the Mongol Golden Horde would rule over and force tribute from Novgorod and other Russian principalities. So, he fought off the Teutonic Knights, yes, but, eventually he also had to appease the Mongols, right, after Kievan Rus was destroyed. Another man is Dmitry Ivanovich Donskoy, who, quote, apparently showed shrewdness and initiative very early. But again, despite his role in Soviet national narratives as a great hero, MacKenzie and Curran say his victory at the Battle of Kulikovo in 1380, quote, changed relatively little on the surface. The Tatar yoke, after all, would not be lifted for about another century after the battle. And finally, we return to President Putin, modern Russia's great man. He may have had a, quote, bulletproof reputation, but he's still flawed, according to the textbook, as evidenced by his poor handling of the Kursk naval submarine disaster and of his threat to democracy. And of course now, again, October 2022, he decided to send his country to a war in Ukraine, which has ended up being a disaster. Not just for the Russian military and Russia itself, and of course Ukraine, but also, also the humanitarian cost, right? So, and that book was the book I'm talking about was published 20 years before that war started. So, what sources do MacKenzie and Curran use? In the early part of the book, they do refer to the Russian Chronicle, the primary Russian Chronicle, as I mentioned earlier. But they don't rely on this source, and they try to look at this source with a view to the practical historical context, despite its rhetorical and slightly mythical nature. They mention old narratives that have been important in Russian history and may offer valid explanations for events. Their efforts in this regard help to demystify Russian history. Again, when you're dealing with a national history that has so few primary sources at certain times, you have to be very careful. But you got to use the sources you have, right? The primary Russian Chronicle was written, I believe about 2 centuries after a lot of the events supposedly took place, right? But so it's not exactly a reliable source necessarily. But again, it's about all we have. So we have to use that. And I think that the textbook has used these sources quite well. It tries to explain them, but it also does caution, hey, well, it's this is what we have, but be careful with this. Who knows? Maybe we'll find something a little bit later on that will be better than the primary Russian chronicle, but I'm not sure. In summary, I do not believe A History of Russia fits Lowen's definition of a bad textbook. It does not give undue worship to Russia's so-called great men, and it does not create a history solely from questionable mythologized sources. Now about a few words about my impressions of this textbook. I've already given some of my impressions already, and I read this book quite a few years ago when I was doing a Russian history course, but I was quite impressed with it. It covers a wide range of topics in detail, from the beginnings of Kiev and the Rus to even the environmental crises in the Yeltsin era. As I mentioned earlier, this textbook tries to achieve balance between the many different modes of thought that exist in Russian historiography. In multiple chapters, MacKenzie and Curran show debates between historians over things such as religion, the impact of Mongol rule, and why the USSR collapsed. It informs readers about the debates in Russian studies, allowing them to move beyond the mere collection of facts, which Lowen complained about when looking at American textbooks. A History of Russia also speculates about key moments, hypothesizing how things could have gone differently. For example, one of the questions in the book was, quote, what if the Tatars did not conquer Kiev and the Rus? Yet, it doesn't go too far into these questions which cannot realistically be answered. I think that hypothetical history is amazing. There are a number of hypothetical history YouTube channels, for example, that really try to answer these questions. Like, for example, one, I believe it's Monsieur Z, that talks about, what if the Russian Alaskan colony survived? What if Russian North America wasn't sold to the United States? So I think questions like that are really amazing. But when you're dealing with a textbook, when you're just want to show the facts, this is Russian history, this is what happened, and these are some of the debates about it. Let's not get too stuck in the weeds of what could have happened in a hypothetical situation that we don't know. Let's do a Rick and Morty situation and go to that universe. But that's kind of difficult. So we can't really do that. So this textbook doesn't do that. And of course, the book cannot give a deep study of every topic or question. Like I said before, a textbook is trying to give a 30,000-foot view of a national history. It can't go so deep. You can't write a master's thesis in about the 1905 Duma and in a textbook. You just can't do it. But the textbook does make an honest and worthwhile attempt to at least give a substantial introduction to Russian history. Again, it goes beyond just facts, but it actually encourages you. Like, what would have happened if this? What do you think? That's what I think the textbook did really well. I'll conclude with some comments from Neil Heyman, who reviewed a previous edition of this book way back in 1977. He praised MacKenzie and Curran for their humility in saying that some areas could not be deeply studied due to a lack of sources. And, of course, Russian history, again, is notoriously infamous for having a lack of sources early on. And, of course, 1977, this was during the Cold War, when I think it would have been a lot harder to do proper historical research on Russia than it is now. The book, said Heyman, would appeal to stronger students in upper-level courses. As I myself found, he thought that the book was an honest effort at explaining Russia's story. So those are some of my thoughts on an old textbook that I used, and I still have it. I haven't looked at it in quite a while, but I know sometimes it was a really nice book to summarize things. Like if I want to look up something or whatever, I found it was a very good source for that of summarizing something. So it was very, very good in that way. I think of the textbooks that I've had, I would say it's probably one of the best that I had. Like, obviously, in my time, I've had a lot of other books during my university and college years, But those were specifically focused on warfare or something like that. But as far as a textbook of a national history, this one was quite good. I think it was probably the best that I've had. I've had Canadian history and American history textbooks too. But again, I'm a Russophile, so I love studying Russian history. So it's so I think this one was definitely one of my best, and I hope that you're able to follow along through the frameworks and everything like that. I know for me, it took a little while for me to wrap my head around them too. But if you've made it this far to the end of the podcast, I appreciate you listening, and I just want to say, just keep taking care of each other. That's one thing I've always wanted to say at the end of my episodes. The war in Ukraine is really a bad thing. Speaking of Russia, Russia has gone on a very dangerous path in deciding to go to war. I do believe that many other countries have also made mistakes that have helped lead to this situation. Of course, I'm not letting them off the hook. But eventually, just like, as we talked about, events and agents, there's agency there. People decided to go on with this war. And as of mid-October now, it's October 10th, very recently, the Crimean Bridge was attacked. And also, a few days after that, now Belarus and Russia have created a joint formation of Russian and Belarusian troops. Whether that means that Belarus is going to join the war in Ukraine after Russian setbacks in the country, I'm not sure. I don't know. But then also a lot of Ukrainian cities were attacked as well. Very, very recently with Kaliber cruise missiles. So I guess, as a lot of people are saying, as a response to the attack on what has been called an attack on the Crimean Bridge a few days ago. So that's the thing. We can't predict. We can't dictate what happens in history. We can't do that. But what we can do, kind of drawing on Hayden White's contextualist mode of formal argument, we all have choices. We all have things we can do. We can't stop everything bad. We can't make everything good. But we can make our lives good. We can make good choices. We can be good to each other. We can be good to Russian people. We can be good to Ukrainian people. We can do that. We need to make that choice. And whatever way we need to do that is up to the situation and up to the context and up to the situation we are in. But whatever the case is, make sure that you are doing the right thing. That's all I can say. And I just want to end. Thank you very much for listening. And I plan to record a few more episodes in the next little while. So I just want to end with God bless and take care of yourselves. And again, take care of each other. Bye for now.